Last week, I launched my first online gouache workshop, Mirror Mirror. Why gouache? Gouache is a downright wonderful medium to paint with. Admittedly, learning to paint with gouache was a journey of struggle and discovery for me personally, but I now love it in capitals, and rightfully so. When looking up information about this paint or art that's made using it, it's obvious that gouache has not reached the popularity of watercolors, oils or acrylics. And that is a downright shame. Gouache has a lot going for it, and especially art journalists should pay attention now if they want to discover something promising. What is gouache anyway? Gouache is often called the brother of watercolor. Some confuse them to be the same thing, which is not true. Watercolor and gouache have a lot in common, but consistency, workability, and look, they differ a lot. Watercolor and gouache are both paints in which pigments are bound to a paste with gum arabic. To watercolor, agents like glycerin can be added for its specific characteristic of transparent flow. In general, watercolor paint dries up bright and transparent. To gouache, usually white pigments are added to make the colors opaque. They dry up uniquely matte like velvet. There are opaque watercolors too, and a few artist-grade brands have stopped adding white to their gouache to leave the opacity up to the artist. But since watercolor requires the addition of a lot of water and gouache of much less, overall, opaque watercolor will never be as opaque as gouache can be, and neither will a transparent gouache be as transparent as a transparent watercolor can be. This has consequences for how the paint looks and how it's worked with. And unfortunately, gouache never matched the popularity of watercolor. When I set out to learn more about gouache, I could find surprisingly little about the medium compared with any other type of paint or art supplies. If you Google painting techniques, most hits will go to acrylics and mixed media. You will see watercolor and oils, but hardly ever gouache. I wondered why. Entering the world of art through an ambition to make picture books, I had seen so many wonderful illustrators being masters with this paint. What was it about gouache then that made it so modest in its online presence? The blog post is an attempt to answer this question. Gouache, the hard part. In the first place, gouache was used as a color medium for painting posters that often consisted of flat surfaces of color. The technique seemed pretty straightforward, and poster painting was considered a designer skill, not art. That didn't help its popularity as an art medium for aspiring artists and art schools, not even for manufacturers of the paint. Only recently have brands like Winsor & Newton begun to put the pigment numbers on the paint of the paint on their tubes, for instance. Also, in an age where swift and easy digital techniques bring forth hitherto unknown depth and variation in colors, oozing three-dimensionality and intricacy, the assumed flatness of gouache might just not be hip and trending right now. We are people pretty much addicted to complicated color styles and effects at the moment. A practical downside of gouache in comparison to watercolor is that the artist-grade version of this paint doesn't come in pans, and only few brands allow decent rewetting after dollops of paint have dried up on the palette. So, the pick-up-and-go ease and swiftness and portability of the watercolor pan sets, together with the availability of opaque watercolors, has kept many artists away from bothering to open and close many colors of gouache. I've been guilty myself of choosing ease over end result in many cases. Gouache is also simply not a hype. We can make it that, but at the moment, gouache has simply been overtaken by the unsurpassably versatile acrylic paint that's super easy to work with, allows to be mixed with just about anything you can think of, quite literally so, and is super easy to paint with and comes in any consistency and opacity one could desire. Only oils and watercolors seem to have been able to stay in the race for those who prefer more classic techniques. Sad as it is, all of this accounts for a whole lot of blankness in the search engines. Gouache isn't talked about as much as the other paints. Not many videos are made about it, and only in the calligraphy world this paint seems to be really appreciated for its unique qualities. But despite hand lettering being da bomb today, gouache has not yet gotten the appreciation it deserves. Finally, and I won't beat around the bush about this, gouache is not an easy medium to work with. In a way it is, but in a huge way it's not. Gouache may be called the opaque version of watercolor, but if you're used to painting with watercolor, you'll find it's something else completely and may find yourself disappointed in the beginning. I'm told that those who come from oil painting have less trouble adapting to this fast-drying matte paint. Gouache can be worked in pretty much the same approach as oils to some extent. Coming from watercolor, in my attempts to learn from the wonderful work of my heroine illustrator Rebecca d'Outremer, who is a true master in gouache, I ended up being at war with this stubborn paint, or it may just have been me that was stubborn, of course, but after 2 years of frustration, after having bought 4 brands thinking I'd been working with bad paint, I came to the point where I wanted to smash every tube against the wall in defeat. After careful analysis of d'Outremer's work, I had seen the layers in her work. I knew how her paintings were built up, but every time I tried to do it myself, I failed, and miserably so. It was immensely frustrating. I could do it in watercolor. Why did gouache end up in disaster time and time again? Fortunately, I never really smashed my paints against the wall. One glorious day, Rebecca d'Outremer posted a little video online of her working on one of her illustrations, and at the same time I met a painter of beautiful Buddhist mandalas who worked in gouache and tempera with ancient techniques and color schemes. Her explanation of the technique, combined with d'Outremer's video, suddenly gave me the insight I'd been dying to get for so long. And then gouache and I hit it off. A new love was born. Gouache is now the paint of my preference, along with watercolor. I'm incredibly glad I stuck with it, because in the end, I have to say that the velvety matte finish of gouache beats the plastic look of acrylics anytime, for me. And certainly in art journaling, it's earned its medals for me. In the next part, I'll get into all the wonderful aspects that gouache has to offer and why it is more than worth it to try this rewarding medium, even if you get yourself into a struggle. The many great aspects of gouache. The most obvious reason why gouache should be in any artist's supply kit is that the beautifully bright colors are opaque and have that unique velvet finish when dry. The paint contains giganormous amounts of pigment and are therefore rich and bright. The end result feels lush and pretty compared to the sometimes plastic sheen you can end up with using acrylics. My Google research found me a few remarks saying people didn't like gouache for being chalky. If they refer to chalky as being a powdery kind of matte, they're right. If they refer to chalky as drying up dry, dull and dusty, they've been using an inferior quality of paint. A decent quality gouache dries up rich and lusciously velvety, and the metallics, they're to die for. Imagine the bright metal-like sheen in an otherwise completely velvety matte image where no glare from dried up paints take away any of its glory. Gouache is simply nothing but lush. Secondly, as opposed to oils, the drying time is miraculously short. It dries almost immediately after application. And when you do want to change a thing or two once it's dry, you can. Going back in with a slightly moist brush can do a lot, let alone adding new opaque layer to alter an image completely. Thirdly, over watercolors, gouache has the huge advantage that it's much better for digital reproduction. The transparency of watercolor drives many artists mad when trying to reproduce their work. It takes a lot of work to match the original, and even then it doesn't look the same. With acrylics, sometimes the sheen of the paint shows through in reproduction, but gouache is simply wonderful. In its matte finish, it simply absorbs any light, so whatever work you make, it's much easier to get close to the original after photographing or even scanning. Maybe that explains why it's a popular medium still in picture books. If this argument should win you over, you should take a look at Schmincke HKS gouache. The colors in that collection are a perfect match to colors that can be digitally reproduced and have been designed exactly for that purpose. So making art in HKS colors almost guarantees a perfect reproduction. As a huge bonus, M. Graham and Schmincke Horadam gouache paints allow rewetting very well. Working with rewetted dollops of gouache from a palette is different than working with gouache straight from the tube. But it really can be done, so if you can still get that pick up and go palette of ready poured colors to work with. You could add a drop or two of glycerin to the freshly poured paint in the pan to allow for easier pick up paint with a wet brush and less cracking. Here's where art journalists should pay extra attention, because here comes a major advantage of gouache. In an art journal, opposite pages will not stick when painted with gouache. All art journalists working with acrylics and mixed media will recognize how sometimes, when leafing through their art journals, they will find that pages stick together. Sometimes to the point where opening them rips the page apart, or the image. I've tried many brands of acrylics, if not all, and I've found that under certain circumstances nearly all acrylics do this. A coat of gel medium sometimes helps, depending on the brand of paint and medium you've used. A light buff of soft wax can help, but makes your page lose archival quality. Varnish doesn't always do the trick either. And gouache is simply non-sticky, so that is a worry you'll never have to have. Some people report that colors of paint rub off on the opposite pages. I've never experienced that myself, but if your brand of paint does that, you could choose to use a fixative on your paint, or a gouache varnish, or a light layer of gum arabic. You could even use a fluid gel medium to make your gouache paint waterproof. Using the thin medium with the matte gouache will not lead to sticking to sticky pages. Besides the unstickiness of the paint, what's more than wonderful about gouache is that it combines so superbly with all kinds of media. Color pencil or pastel over gouache is wonderful, just like gouache over watercolor, and even acrylics will take gouache. Gouache is a perfect medium for mixed media. Finally, gouache is relatively affordable compared to other types of paint. Despite its pigment density, gouache comes at a good price. Concluding. All in all, gouache is really worth an experiment or two if you haven't already tried that. If you're interested, all it would take to start is some watercolor paper, a brush, and an affordable CMYK mixing set of 5 colors, being primary yellow, primary blue, primary red, white, and black. With these colors, you can mix a lot of colors to your liking. Great brands to look for are Schmincke Horadam, Schmincke HKS, M. Graham, Winsor & Newton Designers, Pebeo T7, Talent Gouache Extra Fine, and Lefranc & Bourgeois Linel Extra Fine. Perhaps there are more, but these are the ones I know and have tested to my great satisfaction. If you'd like to start with a project using gouache and mixed media, my latest online class Mirror could be for you. Below this video you will find a link where you can find more information. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and if you did, please subscribe to my channel. Thank you for watching. Bye.